It's so easy to be negative on the markets, and I just drives me up the wall. So I'm watching this guy on Tucker, and I like Tucker, Dave Colum or something like that, who teaches organic chemistry at Cornell up in Ithaca, I think, and beautiful part of the country. And it's just like all these guys, dude. They're just so negative on the markets, and it's all because of valuations. And I'm just like, it's just weird to me. And anyway, by the way, that's why you don't get a tattoo. Look how green that's coming. It's like, dude, it's believe it or not, it used to be black, blue, and red, and now it's like, I don't know what that blue, light pink, and green. Josh, you're so cool with your tattoos. I'm so cool. I mean, one on my back is probably, who knows. But anyway, going back to Dave Colum. He's sitting there saying the market's essentially, I predicted the banking crisis in 2007. And maybe he did, maybe he didn't, I don't know. But now he's calling for, I can't say, I don't want to put words in mouth, but he's saying the markets are going to get essentially pummeled because the CAPE, the Shiller cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio is so high relative to historical norms. And I'm just like, but why is historical norms the benchmark? What makes that the right PE ratio? Does that make sense? It's kind of like these global warming people. Since 1871, blah, blah, blah. It's like, what is the right global temperature? Why is this the right global temperature and not that? You see, especially when you had massive increases in CO2 and the temperatures were crazy high in the 1930s. Then we went crazy low in the 1970s and CO2 was still rising all the time. So what makes the right one? It's recency bias. And this guy talks about recency bias over the last 40 years of the stock market, because I go back 120 years. In 120 years, we had a CAPE ratio of 13, and now it's 38 or 35 or something like that. So it goes, even if we grew our way our economy grew at 2.5% real rate of return, it still take 45 years for the S&P 500 to get to where the historical CAPE ratio is. I'm like, but why is the CAPE ratio the right one? And here, check this out. So Shiller goes back to 1871. Robert Shiller does a CAPE ratio over at, he's at Yale. How many, this is on the S&P 500. The S&P 500 didn't become the S&P 500 until 1957. Do you know that? So previous to that, it was like, the S&P 50 or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. It wasn't even the S&P 500 until 1957. How many stocks and companies were actually in the S&P in the 1800s? Not that many. Basically railroad companies and probably utilities. That's it. And then how many investors were actually in the S&P 500 back then? Or not the S&P, it wasn't S&P. Actually investing in the capital markets. Hardly any. Just executives. That was it. Fast forward until the 1920s and 1930s. Very few investors were investing in the capital markets. All right, how do we know this? Because we can study the population numbers. And you can say, hey, the vast majority of people, their wealth was tied up, if they had a home, was tied up in their home or in whole life insurance. We know that. Then when inflation finally started kicking in the 1940s and 50s, they started getting out of whole life insurance because they weren't keeping up with inflation. And then by then we had, the mortgage rates, 30-year mortgages and whatnot, encouraged people to buy a home. So there wasn't hardly any investing world other than rich executives. And that's it. Mom and Pop Smith were not investing in the equity markets. They just weren't. There wasn't this democracy? No, what's the utility? Whatever the word is. Democratization of investing is really until about the 80s when the 401k came around. There wasn't any. So we've only had 40 years or so of kind of investing market that was a mass appeal. There just wasn't that. Back in the old days, if you were a guy in 1960, buy plastics, you look at investing world like you would the racetracks. It's all gamble speculation. There wasn't any investment market that the mass person could invest in like there is today. There just was not. So why would you sit there and say the average CAPE ratio, essentially price earnings ratio, is 13 going back to 1871, when 1871 we had few companies to invest in and we had few investors to begin with? It doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense at all. So to say, oh, the CAPE ratio is so high now, well, maybe one of the reasons it's so high is because you have so many more investors. And are those investors going to jump ship? Well, as I talked about yesterday, we haven't done it yet so far. Maybe one of the reasons is because there's no competing investment that's worthwhile for the long-term investor. We know compounding interest is better than simple interest. And if I'm getting simple interest on my fixed income accounts for a 30-year investment, that's not going to get the job done, especially if simple interest is only 3 to 4%. And I should expect a 5 to 6% compounded in my equity portfolio. So I hear all these guys saying the market's about to bubble or burst because of historical equity valuations relative to where we are today. I'm like, but what makes a historical equity valuation the right equity valuation? It doesn't make any sense to me. Why is that when you had railroads and utilities? Now we got freaking companies all over the place, small, mid-cap, international, whole thing, with the freaking billions of people potentially investing, where before we had, what, a couple 100,000 people max? Anyway, I don't get it, man. It's weird. Look, I'm not saying the stocks aren't highly valued. I'm just saying to sit there and say, well, the historical averages were way above. Well, what makes the historical averages the right number? Anyway, something I've been thinking about. All right, God bless. Love your thoughts. Fondle that like button. We'll see you.